Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher, and welcome to our second episode of Standouts, where we look at ways and means of being a better player. A lot of people take the stuff that we talk about in Standout, like our previous episode about interrupts and how you should pushing them and being the extra mile and being sort of going forward in that as ways of being just indispensable to the raid and securing a raid spot. But it's so much more than that. So much more. This is all about making you personally a far better player than others because you're doing things that are outside of the ordinary and not just kind of ticking along and becoming a face in the crowd. Today we're talking about taking the initiative and being the volunteer. Now, being the volunteer, what the hell does that mean? A lot of people see that just to mean things like being the flamethrower bro on Bracken Spore or doing these big things that's like, this is part of the fight, somebody has to do it, I'll be that guy, I suppose. But it's way, way more than that. It can be something as simple as being the priest who realizes that maybe his grip can be invaluable in a certain situation and therefore saying, hey guys, what if I do this extra piece of stuff during the fight and then I can grip this guy and then we can make the fight much easier? And people go, oh, okay. And it can be the guy who's like, I'll dispel this. Yeah, you've got some purging and dispelling to do. I'll do it. And then being the guy that like nullifies that entire part of the encounter. Now, why is this important? Why is it important? Because people get messed up. What WoWers tend to do over the last few years is they can't really massively increase different styles and mechanics due to the limitations of the game. There's only so far we can go with it. So what they tend to do is add more mechanics. They just stack them and stack them and stack them, and you'll have pieces of other fights. So if we look at the Blackrock Foundry, which has just been released, there's lots of elements there that particularly I've noticed that are from Nax Ramis. We've got bosses that are very similar to sort of a Hygen style play. If we look at the train boss, certainly on Heroic and upwards, which is a lot of movement, a lot of dancing around, a lot of reprioritizing, a lot of shifting positions. We've got the two German fellows, similar sort of style with a lot of dancing, constant movement, all these things going on, and they're stacking more mechanics on top of that. We include things like we have to interrupt, we have to prioritize ads, we have to change target, we've got bombs going off which need to be dropped by certain players in certain areas, and we have all these things going on, and your average player will go, this is just a lot, and they start fucking up, right? They start like, I don't even notice I've got a bomb on me, I don't notice I'm studying a pool, I can't handle all this stuff, and I'll just kind of DPS and hope that the healers deal with it in some other way. To become a baller, though, and that's what it's all about. And a baller is the guy who's like, you know what? I wish this guy was here. Yeah, I wish this guy was here. Why? Because he's just fucking working, man. I know this guy's putting in work. I know he's doing his job, and we can just have an easier time. You have had these moments where there's a guy in your raid, and when he's not there, shit, this fight just seems way harder. What the hell was that guy doing? Why is this so much more difficult when this guy's not doing this job? And you should want to be that guy. Yeah, you should want to be that guy because, one, you will become a much better player because of it. And the first step to doing it is becoming the guy who volunteers and takes the initiative. And that can be as simple, again, as doing the guy who does the purges, who organizes an interrupt rotation, or simply just says, I can see things that I can do here. Why does this make you a better player? This is the important thing. Because suddenly, all these mechanics, once you're focused on something else, all these other mechanics that are going on around you, actually become much simpler because you're focused on something that's slightly more difficult than what everyone else is dealing with. What you'll tend to find is, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you'll do something like normal mode, and in your guild at the time, it seems quite hard. It seems quite difficult. We struggled with this boss on normal mode. Then you move on to Heroic. You might get a couple of bosses down. Let's take High Maul for an example for current state of affairs. You'll go into High Maul, you'll kill Kargath, you'll kill Butcher, and then eventually you'll work your way up to Imperator, and then you get him down. You struggled with Imperator for a couple of weeks, maybe, depending on your guild. And then you defeated Imperator, and you've cleared normal mode High Maul. So now we're going into Heroic, right? So you do Heroic Kargath, and no big deal. You do Heroic Butcher, and you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. We managed to deal with that situation. And then you go back to a fight that, like 2 weeks ago, you were struggling with, but you've been working on a much more difficult set of standards, a much more difficult set of mechanics, a much more intense situation, that you go back into normal mode, and God, it feels like this is just so easy. I don't understand how, and it's unfathomable that we were wiping on this content a week ago, and now I just feel like this content is so trivial, I just don't understand. And some people will be like, this is because of gear. We just outgear it more, right? We just do this and this and this, and we've had experience with it. Kind of, but more to the point, you've actually been in a much more difficult situation for the last week or so, and you've been dealing with things that are far more important and dealing with mechanics as they should be. Often in like easier content, you tend to nullify mechanics because you can out-heal them and it doesn't really matter if you screw it up. But once you're put into a scenario where you have to deal with those mechanics and you have to take note, you have to focus on them and then come up with strategies that counter them, you go back to the easier version, you're like, God, this makes no sense to me. This is crazy. And often that can also come down to those guys who are being better and more aware at their mechanics. Let's take a more specific example. Let's say Brackenspore. Most people are familiar with Brackenspore and the flamethrower, and dealing with that. And then when you move up to Mythic, which some of you will have done, some of you won't have, you'll realize that the flamethrower actually becomes a huge component of the fight. The flamethrower allows the people dealing with it to gain a huge damage buff, which then nullifies another part of the encounter, that being the spore shooters. Yeah? By the fact that the flamethrower guys can then easily destroy spore shooters, that frees up the rest of the raid to in fact focus on killing the boss and then doing their interrupts on the fungal flesh or avoiding exploding mushrooms and dealing with waves, all this other stuff that people are dealing with. But the guys who deal with the flamethrower not only need to be aware of the waves, the infesting spores, the fucking fungal flesh shaper, they need to be aware of all that. Plus, they need to be far more aware of the timer for things like spore shooters than anyone else in the raid. And therefore, they're so focused on this extra piece of the encounter that no one else is dealing with that the rest of the stuff starts to become much simpler. It starts to become much more obvious. Yeah, I can see the infesting spore timer. Why? Because I'm checking things like small ads are coming, and as such, I can see that going on in the background, and that's not hard for me to deal with, because the last few pulls, and it all comes down to experience and trial and error, I've been moving backwards and forwards way out of this pool instead of just following the boss around like everyone else is doing. You guys, like, by proxy end up in the healing pool. Whereas I, who's out on the fringe, dealing with the flamethrower, getting ready to make sure I've got cooldowns up for spore shooters, doing all this extra stuff, consider that entire mechanic of making sure I'm inside a green fucking pool at a certain time to be absolutely trivial nonsense. Right? It all became part of my rhythm of doing this extra stuff. And then you'll say to yourself, but, and this is the big thing that people hit me with, but, that's all very well and good, Preacher. Yeah, I understand that if I take part in an extra part of the encounter that no one else is dealing with, that this fight will become simpler to me. And I would become a better player because I'm more aware of things that are going on around me rather than just focusing on my DPS. I understand what you're saying, Preacher. The problem is, somebody else already does it. Yeah? Somebody else already does it. And then week on week, this guy turns up and he does it. It was assigned to him on week 1, whether or not he wanted it or not, and he does it every week. And this is where volunteering comes in. So many people are very shy. Very, very shy, and they don't like to disrupt or rock the boat. Even though you might be sat there thinking, God, I wish I could have a go at that. I watched this video by Preacher, perhaps, and he was like, if you try these things out, you'll become a better player because you'll start to learn to be more aware of your environment. You'll start to learn to be more aware of what boss timers are doing and how I can deal with them and how I can react with them. The problem is, Preacher, is somebody else already does it. And this is why you need to be the volunteer. No one should ever be afraid to say, can I have a go at that? And what you might find is two things. One, your raid leader can be a bit of a douche or doesn't trust you for whatever reason and says, no, you can't. We'll leave it to this guy. And sometimes the raid leader might be like, you know what? It works if we leave our standard team doing it. I don't want to wipe here, and therefore we're not going to allow you to do it. And for you as a player, I would raise that as a red flag. If you are confident that you can have a go at this and see if you can just like push yourself a little bit, as you should always willing to be, is to push yourself a little bit, then, you know, you should raise a red flag there. It's like, no, I think I can have a go at this. I would like to have a go and have a try at it. And the other guy might be like, no, but I want to do a DPS, a high world of logs. And it's like, well, it's, you know, maybe next time then. Maybe next time something comes up, you guys go out, you research the boss, you know when something's coming up that needs some volunteer work, that needs a little bit of extra, and then as soon as it comes up, it's like, right, we've got this mechanic to deal with, you're the first to go, I'll deal with that. Hey, raid leader, yeah, you didn't let me have a go on Brackenspore or whatever it might be, but I want to deal with this now. Okay, give me my chance, give me my shot. And this is all about wanting to improve. I often find that the most disappointing players are the guys who are really excited about things like the Butcher. Yeah? About things that are essentially training dummies. I find that really sad sometimes. I do. Generally, as a player, it's like, oh, God, I hope we get to the Butcher. I'm like, why? That fight is fucking boring. It's boring as shit. Why? Because all we do at that fight is DPS, or we just heal. And, you know, there's a little bit of extra work going on for the healers, no doubt, and I don't mean to offend. But any fight that has very, very simple mechanics, I find intolerably dull. To the point of this lacks entire imagination. There's no fun to be had here. And to be excited about it, it's always nice to get a really high DPS score. Of course it is. Of course it is. But ultimately, week after week, I'm not too into this, right? I'm pretty bored after the first go. And therefore, I'm not into it. What I prefer is a fight where there's stuff going on and there's stuff to deal with. I think it shows a much better player when there is a huge mess of an encounter and you're prevailing. You're coming out ahead of people who you shouldn't be. That's where you start to shine as a player, as you're dealing with this mechanic, you're dealing with all this extra stuff, and it's not just a training dummy. You'll often find players, and again it's a red flag for raid leaders in my opinion, who are great on fights like the Butcher. And suddenly their DPS appears as if from nowhere. You're like, wow, I never thought this guy could do this DPS. Then you have a fight where they have to do a couple of extra things and their DPS collapses like a fucking house of cards. It falls to the goddamn floor. Yeah? And those are guys who are pretty crappy with dealing with the extra environments. They're dealing with mechanics, being aware of mechanics, and just basically hoping and praying. And you should ask yourself this question. Do you respond to stuff if your raid leader doesn't call it out? That's the big difference, and that's why taking the initiative and being a volunteer will push you out of that. Will push you out of that realm, that bubble. Like, I just do my job, which is either to damage or heal the tanks or tank things and move when my raid leader tells me. If my raid leader doesn't tell me to move, I don't move. If my raid leader doesn't tell me to switch target, I don't switch target. If my raid leader doesn't tell me to interrupt, I don't interrupt. Yeah? If no one tells me to do it, I don't do it. If you're in that position right now, if you're listening to this and you're like, you know, that's kind of me. This is where you can push that forward, is by being a volunteer. Sometimes it does involve studying ahead. Like I said, your raid leaders might not be okay with changing what works. And you can't blame them from that. If your raid leaders are happy with what works, they just want to kill the boss and move on to the next bit of progress instead of working on some farm boss, fair enough. Fair enough. But there will be a fight coming. There'll be a fight coming where you can stand up and be the guy. And when you're in that situation, and this is what I encourage you all to do, is to be the guy who is in that situation, which is doing something more. Look for ways to do more, because you'll find the rest of the fight becomes easier. Your DPS becomes higher because you are more aware of what's happening. You're great with dealing with the mechanics. And in fact, the rest of the stuff that people are really struggling with now becomes second nature to you, because you won't not only have to be aware of that, but you have to be aware of more things. Now, some of you might suck at it. You might think, I'll go to LFR and try it out. I tried. I thought, you know what? I'll go to LFR and I'll do some flamethrower stuff for a quick clip. And honestly, you can't do it. LFR is just not a place to try this stuff out. If you try some Bracken Spore LFR flamethrower, you'll find that you can't really get above a certain amount of stacks without just running around the whole fucking room. There just simply isn't enough moss. The mechanics just don't work in LFR to try this out. So what you need to do is you need to get yourself in a raid and try it out, whether that be in an alt raid, join in on some fun run or something like that. You can all have these options to do things, but please, to stand out, to be the better player, to make yourself better, to not be a disposable face in the crowd, you need to work on things like this. You need to be the guy who says, hey, I'll deal with that. Hey, I've got an idea that might work. And sometimes your ideas might fucking suck. They might not work at all. That's okay. That's all right, but having ideas is the important thing. Thinking about what's going on in the fight and making it work. That's the important thing. Raising your voice and saying, hey, what about this? And if everyone goes, nah, I don't think that's going to work, that's fine, but have fucking ideas. Volunteer. Do something more. Don't be excited by the Butcher. Don't be. Be excited when things are going to get chaotic. How can you make this easier on everyone else? Be that guy, because that's going to make you much better. Make you a much better player. And all this silly stuff like DPS rotations will just fall into the background as a natural part of the course. All right, guys, stand out. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.